Hello. The following photo story shows the events throughout the Cold War and the nature of how these affected the USSR and the US.
At the Potsdam Conference in mid-1945, US President Harry Truman, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill gathered to discuss the post-war divisions of Germany. At this conference, Truman informed Stalin that the United States had successfully detonated the first atomic bomb on July 16, 1945, in an attempt to intimidate him. Stalin casually reacted to this and simply said that he hoped that the weapon would be put to good use against the Japanese.
At the time of the nuclear bomb dropping on Japan in August, the situation in post-war Germany between the West and the East was still unsettled. Stalin also felt that the Soviets had been cut out of any involvement in the Pacific. From Stalin's point of view, the Allies and the Soviets had shared in the spoils of defeating Germany, and the same should happen in the Pacific, because if the Soviets had not fought against the Germans, then the US would not have been able to convincingly defeat Japan.
From the American point of view, they had fought the Pacific War entirely by themselves. Therefore, they should be the only country to reap the benefits of defeating Japan. Stalin swiftly reacted to the first atomic bomb dropping on Hiroshima on the 6th of August by declaring war on the Japanese on the 8th of August and sending 700,000 soldiers to attack Japanese-occupied Manchuria. This was a last-ditch attempt from Stalin to gain some involvement in the Pacific War. However, the conflict ended the next day on the 9th, when the USA dropped the second bomb on Nagasaki.
In the years following the Second World War in Greece, the communists engaged in violent conflicts against the government forces who were receiving massive military and financial aid from Britain and later the US. These countries feared that Greece would in turn fall to the communists. The United States was committed to preserving the independence and territorial integrity of the kingdom and encouraged the authorities to establish a government of national unity and undertake a series of economic reforms. Greece enjoyed the benefits of the Marshall Plan and gradually became part of the Western systems, joining the Council of Europe in 1949 and NATO in 1915. The defeat of the communist revolt in Greece, which meant more than 50,000 people died, marked the end of the spread of Soviet influence in Europe.
The Soviet Union initially wanted to spread communism to Greece in order to increase its influence over the Mediterranean to gain access to new trade routes. After Stalin witnessed the manner in which the USA supported the Democratic Party in Greece, he knew that although both sides had been on the winner's side of World War II, there was still a conflict on the horizon. This is supported by Stalin's 1946 election speech, when he famously said, "As a matter of fact, the war broke out as the inevitable result of the development of world economic and political forces on the basis of present-day monopolistic capitalism." Stalin's public approach to disagreeing with capitalism fueled the anti-communism response from the USA, which would influence presidential elections in the years to come.
After the end of World War II, the East and West went about occupying their sectors of Germany and Berlin, as agreed upon at the Potsdam Conference. On the 1st of January 1947, the French, British and American sectors merged to create what was known as the Tri-Zone. Before the Tri-Zone formed, the post-war economy in Western Germany was detrimental to shopkeepers, as there was no stable currency to use for purchases of goods. This led to the flourishment of the black market that involved transactions of bartering rather than tangible currency. After the Tri-Zone was created, the US combated this economic crisis by introducing a new currency, the Deutschmark. The introduction of this currency ended the crisis, meaning that shopkeepers could now sell their goods to make a steady profit.
The Soviet reaction to this was very negative, as Stalin wanted to prevent reparation and reunification so that Germany could not pose a future threat to the Soviet Union. The flourishment of the economy in the West was great news for the USA, because if the Western nations could develop better than the East, then this would be evidence that communism is inferior to capitalism, preventing the spread of communism to other nations. This event led to one of the most iconic moments of the Cold War and one of the greatest aviation operations in history. After Stalin observed the Western efforts to repair Germany's economy, he responded by cutting all land, canal, and rail supply routes from West Berlin to West Germany on the 24th of June 1948. The USA simply reacted to this by flying its supplies into West Berlin. Over the 11 months of what was known as the Berlin Airlift, approximately 189,000 flights were made and 2.3 million tons of supplies were delivered to the West. After realizing that this situation had not developed in Stalin's favor, he ordered the end of the blockade on the 12th of May, 1949.
This was a crushing defeat to the East, as not only did the beginning of the blockade showcase Stalin's fears of Western influence, but the capabilities of a strong Western economy were put on display for the world to see. The Berlin Airlift caused the Soviets to shift its focus away from Germany and toward other efforts, which had a potential to facilitate the spread of communism.
The USSR began the development of its own atomic bomb program in 1943, aided by information and plans stolen from the Manhattan Project by Soviet spies. The USSR was able to develop its own nuclear weapon only a few years after the end of World War II. In August of 1949, the Soviets conducted a successful test of a 20-kiloton bomb years ahead of American predictions. This meant that the USA no longer held a nuclear monopoly over the world. This was effectively the beginning of the arms race between the two superpowers.
The arms race caused tensions to rise between the two sides. This consequently led to the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, which brought the world the closest it's ever been to nuclear war. This period marks an intense time in history when two countries were racing to stockpile the most destructive weapons possible and were willing to utilize these weapons at the expense of each other.
On the 1st of November 1952, the United States tested its first thermonuclear device, the hydrogen bomb. This bomb detonated on a remote island 3,000 miles west of Hawaii. The mushroom cloud that followed the fireball was 160 kilometers wide, and the yield of the explosion was more than 700 times larger than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The island was completely vaporized and is now completely submerged under the sea. This changed the course of the arms race, seeing that the potential destructive scale of the hydrogen bomb was 700 times larger than that of the atomic bomb. This led to both nations tightening their governmental security on home soil, and communications between the two sides have been completely cut off in an attempt to preserve vital information about the developments of each side's superweapons. This was the moment when the possibility of nuclear war became realistic, because without communication, it is impossible to predict what will happen in the future. Japan began ruling Korea in 1910, but ceded control of Korea when it surrendered at the end of World War II. The United States and the USSR agreed to split Korea into two occupation zones. The North Zone of the 38th parallel was occupied by the USSR, and it helped the Koreans living there form a communist government. The US occupied the South, and it oversaw elections that resulted in a democratic government. When the two major powers withdrew, friction between the North and South finally erupted into war in 1950, when North Koreans invaded the South. The South was unprepared for the aggression and was immediately overrun. Eventually, the US stepped in to help the South Korean military, essentially creating a proxy war between the Soviet Union and the United States. No final peace treaty was ever signed to end the Korean War. Instead, the two sides signed an armistice in 1953 that ceased hostilities and formed the Korean Demilitarized Zone, a no-man's land between the two countries which constituted the new border.
The development of this conflict made it apparent that both sides were willing to promote a regime similar to theirs in a violent and conflictive manner, once more fueling the struggle between democratic and communist influence. Both sides feared a domino effect that if one supporting nation fell, the other would too, until it would be the end of the world against them. This sparked Soviet and US involvement in a multitude of conflicts across the world.
The Cuban Revolution was an armed revolt in the 1950s. It was led by Fidel Castro against the government of Fulgencio Batista. Batista was finally removed from office on January 1st, 1959. Cuba went on to sign a treaty with the USSR. This was terrible news for the USA, because now the USSR had a communist nation very close to American shores. This caused the USA to focus its spy network on Cuban relations with the USSR and both Cuban imports and exports in the years to come. Southeast Asia, particularly Vietnam, was considered an important sphere of influence by both US and Soviet leaders. When nationalist forces created North Vietnam in 1956, the USSR and China recognized and backed the new communist country while the US became committed to stopping the spread of communism in the region and backed South Vietnam. In Korea, the US and the USSR avoided direct warfare by backing the opposing governments and forces. However, this conflict reached a boiling point, which caused President Lyndon Johnson to send in US troops. The war was immensely unpopular amongst the American public, as the phrase "make love, not war" became popular. The American troops were completely overwhelmed by the conflict, as they were fighting a war under incredibly foreign conditions. After seeing that the war had not developed in America's favor, President Richard Nixon withdrew the last of the US forces and aides to South Vietnam in 1975. North Vietnam ultimately prevailed in the war, and Vietnam was unified into the Socialist Republic of the Vietnam in 1976.
The result of the Vietnam War was a staggering defeat for the US and a rare victory for the communist regime. The USA initially feared that if Vietnam fell, the communists would spread to Laos, Cambodia, and even India. Similar to the Soviet Union in 1948, the US began to focus its attention on other efforts that would prevent the spread of communists and increase the influence of capitalism.
The US and the USSR each wanted to achieve technological superiority over the other. Included in that struggle was the race to become the first country to build a rocket capable of launching an object into space. Not only would this be an immense technological achievement, but a rocket that was powerful enough to carry a payload into space could also carry a nuclear warhead capable of reaching the other country. In October of 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite. Average Americans could turn on their AM radios and hear Sputnik transmit its beeping signal. Sputnik caught Americans off guard and embarrassed the nation. For the US military, this was proof that the USSR had the missile technology to attack the United States with nuclear weapons. The USSR put Sputnik 2 in orbit before the US was able to build its first satellite. This was terrible news for the USA because now it was apparent to the public that capitalist society was not necessarily more technologically advanced than a communist society. Additionally, the space race effort became publicly unsupported as NASA required funding that was required through taxpayers. The USA reacted to the launch of Sputnik by focusing more effort on the development of NASA. American media also somewhat changed the dimension of the space race by declaring that America's goal was to put a man on the moon, thus moving the figurative finish line of the space race.
By 1961, massive numbers of East Berliners were fleeing through the open border to West Berlin after witnessing the economic development of the West compared to the East. Late on August 12th, in an effort to stem the tide of defectors, Soviet Premier Khrushchev gave the East Germany government permission to stop the flow of immigrants by closing the border for good. Construction of the Berlin Wall on the border between East and West Berlin began on August 13th. The first construction of a barbed wire and concrete block fence was created in just 2 weeks. The wall was more than 26 miles long, and eventually the barbed wire fence was replaced with a 13-foot wall. The construction of the Berlin Wall was not a bad thing for the US in some respects, as it was a public display that the communists did not have a grassroots support from its people. This is supported by a quote that President John F. Kennedy made during a speech where he addressed the construction of the wall. JFK said, "Let them come to Berlin. Freedom has many difficulties and democracy is not perfect, but we have never put a wall up to keep our own people in and to prevent them from leaving us."
Known as Big Ivan to the Soviets and a Tsar bomber to the US, RDS-220 was the largest nuclear weapon ever built. Designed as a 100 megaton hydrogen bomb, its yield was reduced by 50% when it was tested to prevent destructive measures. The device was airdropped from an altitude just above 34,000 feet over an island on October 30th, 1961. It detonated at 13,000 feet and its fireball still reached the Earth, a feat that no missile had achieved before. The creation of the Tsar bomber was simply a Soviet reaction to the testing of the American H-bomb some 10 years earlier. After American intelligence communicated to the White House that the Tsar bomber was several times more powerful than its own hydrogen bomb, President Kennedy attempted to reach a diplomatic peace treaty with the Soviets in an attempt to limit nuclear testing. After this was rejected by the USSR, Kennedy announced that he would continue to push for peaceful reform rather than a violent one.
The largest land-based missile ever developed by the US, the Titan II intercontinental ballistic missile, was 30 meters tall and 3 meters in diameter. The Titan II could launch from its underground silo in just 58 seconds, and it carried the W-53 warhead with its yield of 9 megatons. The blast created by this warhead was not as powerful as Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs, but could still destroy a city. The creation of this missile caused the Soviets to accelerate their own missile development, seeing that now the nuclear warhead threat had moved from bombs to a more mobile, concealable alternative, being missiles.
On October 14, 1962, the CIA briefed President John F. Kennedy that an American U-2 spy plane had taken photographs of Soviet nuclear missile launch sites under construction in Cuba. He formed a group of advisors that would later become the Executive Committee, or EXCOM, to develop the U.S. response. Eventually, the U.S. Navy created a blockade of Cuba and announced that any Soviet ships entering Cuba would be stopped and searched. In response, the Soviets put its military into full combat readiness, and the USA followed suit, as well as planning a land invasion of Cuba. This caused the US Strategic Air Commission to move to DEFCON 2 for the first time in history, DEFCON 1 meaning nuclear war. The day before the land invasion of Cuba was set to take place, Khrushchev wrote a letter to Kennedy stating that any suggested agreement must entail the removal of US missiles from Turkey. The US agreed to remove the Jupiter missiles from Turkey, and on October 28th, Khrushchev announced that Soviet missiles would be removed and transferred from Cuba. Following the crisis, Kennedy's image was greatly enhanced, both domestically and internationally. Additionally, both the USA and the Soviet Union took steps to prevent all-out nuclear warfare with the introduction of the doctrine MAD, standing for Mutually Assured Destruction. The Cuban Missile Crisis prompted the US and USSR to set up a direct line of communication between the two countries to enable rapid and direct communication between them in crisis situations that might impact the security of either country, such as the accidental launch of nuclear weapons. Commonly referred to as the red phone, the communication link was actually a teletypewriter that transmitted written messages. The hotline reduced the time it took for the US and the USSR to communicate directly with each other and reduced the possibility of misunderstandings. The US first used the hotline to explain US fleet movements in the Mediterranean, which could have been interpreted as hostile. The establishment of the hotline was a good step for both parties involved due to the fact that if the US or the USSR had a concern, they could communicate with each other and prevent any misunderstandings. Previously, the idea of a capitalist regime rationally communicating with a communist regime was unheard of. Now that the two sides were simply willing to listen to each other and communicate, their relations could be improved, thus leading to the de-escalation of the Cold War in the years to follow. This conflict between the capitalist regime of the USA and the communist regime of Soviet Russia was not very active, but still influenced many proxy wars around the world, as the USA never completely declared war on the Russia and vice versa. All in all, the de-escalation of events was required, and it affected many governments, including US presidents and Soviet leaders. To conclude, the Cold War is an example of how two superpowers and their conflict can involve so many others around the world and even bring it the closest it has ever been to its destruction.